All right, welcome everybody. So glad you're here. Great to see another good group here for this second of our evaluation webinars. As some of you are already doing, and as Liz encouraged you to do, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your name and your organization. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Andy Davey for Madison Community Foundation. And yeah, so this is the second of our evaluation webinar series that we're kicking off this year in 2022. Many of you did join for the first one, but for those of you who didn't and would like to see the recording, I'll post the link in the chat now. And today's webinar is also being recorded and will be posted on that same spot probably early next week. And so today is both part of ongoing collaboration with the Wisconsin Center for Education Research, Annalee Good and Anthony Hernandez, who are here today with us. And it's also part of ongoing efforts by MCF to offer capacity building resources to nonprofits in the community, but especially it's part of ongoing efforts to try to cultivate and foster more meaningful and equitable evaluation practices in our community for us as a foundation, for nonprofits, and hopefully also for other funders in the community. And really the idea is to make evaluation more useful and meaningful for you all and for the community members that you serve or with whom you work. And so the aim really is to create an environment of mutual learning and respect. And so I am truly here learning alongside with you all. And so all of this is a little bit of an experiment. And so today's webinar is going to be a little bit more of a traditional content delivery type webinar where I think Annalee primarily and Anthony as well are going to be talking about logic models and theories of action. Please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A to ask questions, and there'll be some time at the end, especially. But as we move forward, so we'll be hosting some other events and opportunities throughout the year. We really want to create a space for interaction and peer learning for you all to share insights with each other, ask questions, dig in, and try to figure things out together, guided and facilitated by Annalee and Anthony. So again, today, just to set the expectations, a little bit more traditional content delivery, but then as we move forward, we're really going to try to open up more of an interactive space. So I will, at this point, pass it over to Annalee.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. I'm really glad to be here. I'll briefly introduce myself, and then Anthony will do the same, and then we'll jump right in. And I really appreciate all of you being here and seeing you here. My name is Annalee Good, and I'm at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. And in that role, get to work with a lot of community-based organizations, school districts, state agencies around knowledge mobilization, evaluation and research, usually in the context of education, but of course, because it's education, lots of different things overlap with that. So with that, Anthony, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Glad to join you today. I'm Anthony Hernandez. I am a postdoctoral fellow at WCER, and I work on similar projects that Annalee just described. Good to be with you today.
So as Andy described, we're starting a new partnership where Anthony and myself and Andy and many of you are in a learning space, a co-learning space focused around evaluation and specifically culturally responsive and equitable evaluation. So we're going to focus on a couple different guiding questions. Before we start in and describing those guiding questions, I do want to just pause and show some gratitude to you all for being here. I know that people are navigating a lot to be in this space. Really appreciate you being here. Also want to give thanks to Madison Community Foundation for creating this space in the first place and for the partnership. I really appreciate that. And for the opportunity to reflect. And I also want to acknowledge and show appreciation to the Ho-Chunk Tribal Nation upon whose ancestral land I'm sitting on right now, called Dejo. If you want to know more about the land that you're sitting on, there is an amazing resource that I will drop into chat right now. And you can go anywhere in the world and it'll show you the indigenous and ancestral histories of the land that you're sitting on. So the guiding questions for today, first of all, what is culturally responsive and equitable evaluation, and why do we do it? That was the content of our, that was the focus of our previous webinar. We're just going to touch briefly on it for those of you that were at that webinar and need to kind of reorient or refresh, and those who were not at that previous webinar, just to set the orientation and kind of the grounding for why we're talking about logic models and theories of action today. Second guiding question, why is it important to show the logic of what you're trying to do? And then lastly, how can theories of action and logic models help towards that goal of showing the logic of what you're doing? So first and briefly, we're going to talk a little bit about what is culturally responsive and equitable evaluation and why do we do it. Some of the work that we do at WCER works to try to center youth in the work of evaluation. So the slide that you see right here, I want to give attribution to the youth evaluation team at Centro Hispano, who helped to create this slide. Evaluation, so we all evaluate all the time. You evaluate things in your life, whether it's the temperature of the room that you're in, you evaluate your role in relationship to an organization. When we talk about program evaluation, we're trying to systematically figure out what's going on with a program or an initiative. A colleague of ours calls it group learning. So evaluation is a systematic way to learn, to reflect for the purposes of improvement, for the purposes of action. When we think about doing that process, that systematic reflection process and group learning process, when we think about doing that in a culturally responsive way, culture needs to be at the center of that process. And so when we think about culture, I'm going to read a definition of culture by Dr. Geneva Gay. A dynamic system of social values, cognitive codes, behavioral standards, worldviews, and beliefs used to give order and meaning to our own lives as well as the lives of others. So culture is central to how we make sense of ourselves as humans. It's central to how we communicate. It's how we organize ourselves. It's how we identify both individually and collectively. So if culture is so central to who we are as humans, why would we try to remove it from a process that is attempting to systematically understand or make sense of or give order to things? That takes a lot of purposeful reflection. And so when we talk about culturally responsive evaluation and equity focused evaluation, there's kind of three primary principles underlying this work. So the first is that you're constantly critically reflecting. So you're critically reflecting on your own identities. You're reflecting on the identities of those that you're working with. You're critically reflecting on power dynamics, on structural and systemic contexts, like, for example, how institutionalized racism is showing up, not only in the interactions, in the work of the program, but also in the conditions and the systems that are around the work that you're doing. So that critical reflection is really important, and humility is a very important part of that critical reflection process as well. A second principle to culturally responsive equitable evaluation is that you're engaging many voices. So you're engaging those that are closest to the work and also those closest to the potential impact of the program that you're hoping to have. And that this engagement is authentic and that it's over time. It's again and again and over time. And this last piece is that when you're doing this work and you're doing this work for improvement, that you're acting on what you're learning and you're acting on this systematic process. Now, central to any evaluation is that it's for improvement, so that there's an action already involved in that. What makes evaluation equitable or equity focused is that you're also focusing on changing systems and changing the context and the conditions around what makes the program doing, or the problems or the needs. So these three pieces, critical reflection, engaging voices, and acting for change, are these underlying principles that then impact how we do this work. And so those of you that were at the previous webinar will remember this slide. It is an overview or a summary of the different steps of evaluation. And the green is highlighting those parts where we are embedding the principles of culturally responsive evaluation, equitable evaluation. So today, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, on these different steps, because today is really to focus in on one particular part of one of these steps. So when you're getting organized around evaluation, one of the things you need to do is to define the it. What are you hoping to systematically understand? What are you hoping to improve? And so there are a lot of different ways that you can go about defining that it and conceptualizing it and thinking about it. I do want to take a second though and drop into chat. We created a worksheet for the last webinar that you can use once you're done listening, once you're done watching, to kind of think on your own around a program or an initiative that you might want to do this with. You'll see, again, if you were at the previous webinar, you'll see that the worksheet now is updated to have a couple more resources around logic models and theories of action. So it's more, you know, customized for this webinar, but it's a resource there. You can use it if it's helpful as you're listening today, and also afterwards to really start to dig in and try to do this work with you and your team. So why is it important to show the logic of what you're doing? Lots of different reasons. Logic is inherently cultural. So the idea of a logic underlying a program inherently has people's cultural lenses, identities playing a part in how you're defining what the logic is. Making that logic explicit, making it so that it's outside of people's heads and it's out on a page, has a lot of different benefits. So one of the benefits is that it gets it out of your head. So you can think, many of you are probably part of organizations where maybe the organization was started by the person who's now leading it, and that the logic of the program is really clear in that person's head. But that likely is not the only person implementing that program or having those programs impact. So having that logic out of people's heads and literally on a page encourages reflection, and it encourages conversation about things that might be assumptions, that maybe one person is having an assumption that that's what the problem is we're trying to address. And actually, that's not what these three people are assuming the problem is that we're trying to address. It also encourages alignment. So once you have, and you'll see this once we really dig into the parts of a logic model, having to get it all out of your head and on a page or on a screen or whatever, on sticky notes or pipe cleaners or whatever you're going to use, getting it out there encourages you to see the connections between these different parts. So we'll get all into this when we talk more specifically about the different parts of the logic model. So theories of action and logic models are two different tools that you can use to get the logic explicit. It's a way, these are both really good tools, and many of you, I'm sure, have used theories of action or theories of change or logic models in the past before. So this isn't new to many of you, these ideas of these tools. One of the benefits of these tools is that it helps you to communicate your work with lots of audiences. It also helps you to stay accountable to it. So all these different reasons make sense for if you don't have a logic model or you don't have a theory of action already for the program that you're doing. I encourage you to really think specifically today as we're talking about one program or initiative that you're doing that would benefit from something like this. It helps to have like a concrete example, and we're going to pull an example through today, but I encourage you to have one to think of for you too. Okay, so we're going to first talk more briefly about theories of action. We're going to spend most of today on logic models, but we're going to talk a little bit about theories of action. Okay, so before we talk about theories of action, we're going to talk about theories of change. Okay, so all of you likely have heard these terms flying around. So theory of action, theory of change, logic model. And many, just like with the word evaluation or the concept evaluation, Many people have many different understandings or definitions of what all these things are. So what we're going to put out there as our understanding of what these are is one of many. We do feel like it's common and that it's useful. But please know that you might see a theory of action that looks more like a logic model out there. You might see somebody's logic model that actually, I would maybe say that's more of a theory of change. There's, again, many different ways that people interpret this and many different ways that people express it or communicate it or draw it. Okay. A theory of change and a theory of action they're all cousins of each other. A theory of change is an if-then that focuses and maps out specifically the if-then of change. Okay? So for example, if we increase teachers' knowledge and skills, if we increase teachers' knowledge and skills, their practice will improve and student learning will improve. That's a theory of change because it's all talking about different parts of the change. It's an if-then within the concept of change. A theory of action is related and similar, but it takes it kind of another step and talks about the if-then connection between the doing, the activities or the actions that you're doing, the programs. The if we do these programs, then we're going to see this change. Okay, so they're related, but the components can be different. And so this example that we have of a theory of action, it says we will achieve these goals if we do these things, program, actions, activities. And then in order to do those activities and actions, you have to have these resources. So I want to show you a couple other examples of theories of action, theories of change, just to show you that it doesn't all have to look a certain way. Oftentimes, there we go. The bottom right, so that's a somewhat more, again, these are, I want to find a better word than typical, traditional, normal. I don't want to use these terms that then make it so that is the normal. But the boxes and arrows is a common way that a theory of action is represented. We all know that life is not linear. Our experiences are not linear. Logic is not linear, therefore. But oftentimes we end up trying to represent it in a linear way. To the extent that sometimes different funding agencies, for example, we do a lot of work with AmeriCorps programs. And the AmeriCorps grant program has the logic model that you have to pull in is already set on how it's represented. It is boxes and arrows. I understand that sometimes the boxes and arrows can also be helpful. But there's other ways too of representing a theory of action or a theory of change. So then above the, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the top right is a different theory of change. Now, this is an example of one that could look a little bit more like a theory of action, right? Because they have strategies and they have current conditions. But what I want you to see here is more the visual representation. And then the one on the left is a completely different way of visually representing a theory of action. When we look at logic models, we'll also look at a couple other examples of when you can use images and pictures to represent logic and to represent a theory of change in ways that really help to communicate, but also to tie into the cultural identities and the cultural context in which you're working. So I'm going to pause for a second because we're going to move into logic models, but pause for a second if there are any questions. Again, I want to reiterate what Andy had mentioned. Please feel free to put questions into the chat or into the Q&A, into the Q&A around theory of change, theory of action. If there's things that come up as you're thinking, and we can always come back to it too, after we dig into logic models a little bit. Chances are if you have a question, somebody else does too. Okay. So logic models. So what's the relationship between a theory of action and a logic model? And why would you use one versus the other? So oftentimes organizations will first do a theory of action or a theory of change because they are more 30,000 foot level. So they're pretty high level, and it really is important to get at those core pieces of what are we trying to do and what are we doing to get to that thing, to get to that change. So a lot of organizations start with a theory of change or start with a theory of action. And once they get that down, then the logic model brings it down to more like the 10,000 foot or the 5,000 foot level. And it operationalizes, or it breaks down into all of the smaller components, the parts that the theory of action are kind of big picture on. So what you see here is a logic model design, again, that is linear, and life nor logic are ever linear, but it shows a lot of the common components of a logic model, and at least attempts to get at that this is a little bit cyclical. So this is a diagram and a template that we created, but based on lots of other other examples. Okay, and Tom, I see your question. So more of a thought than a question. From a fundraising standpoint, I think vision and impact are the two key components to lead with and inspire the donor. The strategies next and the action last. Yeah, great. I love that. Thank you. And that vision and impact, you have to get on the same page for before you can even start to think about what are you going to do to get there. So yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you. So logic models, again, can come in so many different formats, but the components are often pretty similar. So they might come with different words. They might have different level, like grain sizes, especially when we're talking about something like outcomes. There might be different grain sizes, but these are pretty common components. So I'm going to show you a couple other examples of different types of logic models, and then we're going to come back to this diagram and then go through each of the components about what do we mean when we say activities? What do we mean when we say outputs? This is an example if it's a resource from Madison Community Foundation, and the website is on there. You can access this, and it's part of their grant development resources. So you see a lot of those common inputs, right? A program or the description of the activities. What is it that you're actually doing? The input or resources. We'll talk about what all these things mean. Outcomes. So tables are really helpful ways to start organizing sometimes and just get your thoughts organized before you think about the relationship between things. Couple other examples. So the Mississippi Children's Museum, the one on the top left. So this example has, again, some of these similar components that we just talked about, but then it breaks it down. One of the things I like about here is the color coding. So you can use things like color coding to have streams of work. So many of you are in organizations that don't just have one program, and maybe you want your whole organization to have a logic model that involves lots of different programs. And so you can imagine ways of distinguishing or coding the logic of a program and then how it fits into the larger logic of your organization. So I like that one, and I also like, if you look in the outcomes part, how they've centered people. Children will gain. All attendees will gain. Teachers, parents, caregivers will gain. So it's very people focused. The one on the bottom right is just another way of representing logic. It's an ecological model, and it is still a little linear, but it's much more, it's kind of more space-based. And yes, I apologize about the print. The idea here is just seeing how it is formatted, so the content of it is less important. If people are interested in some of these examples, we can, I can drop the links in. It's more just to see that logic can be represented in lots of different ways. This last example I want to show you is from the Lummi Tribal Nation on the Northwest coast. One of our colleagues, Dr. Nicole Bowman, had worked with the Lummi Nation in developing a logic model for their systems of care. One of the things I want to point out here is, again, a lot of the similar components, but that the logic itself here absolutely is pulling in the cultural context of the Lummi Nation, not only with the images themselves, and that the images represent aspects of their own cultural context, but that the images themselves are showing the logic. And so the outcomes are a canoe. So the canoe is representing part of the logic, the core logic of the Lummi Nation is around collectivity, is around the collective, is how we are going to get there. And so that the canoe not only has historical and cultural connections to Lummi Nation, but also from the logic standpoint, a canoe only moves, or it moves best when everyone is paddling in the same direction and is paddling. So ways to think about how are you going to represent logic in culturally responsive ways. Okay, so we're going to come back to this design. And I encourage you that so we're going to go through each of the different components and kind of define them. I'm going to give an example throughout. I encourage you either to use that worksheet or just a piece of paper that you might have sitting next to your computer. You can start to draw things out and start to think about, well, what would the activities be in this program that you're interested in developing a logic model for, and just start playing around. You know, it can be a little bit of a sandbox. Okay, so the first, actually, let me see if I can make this bigger. Okay, I don't know if that helps. Okay, so the first component, call to action. So the call to action is one that is often not in logic models. We like to put it in here because it sets the landscape for why you're there in the first place. Why are you doing this? So in other cases, sometimes this is called the problem statement or a statement of need. Lots of different ways to think about that. Oftentimes there is a problem or there is a need that a logic model is trying, or a program is trying to address. But sometimes that can be kind of deficit focused. And maybe it's that there's an amazing thing happening in your community that you need programs to help support and to help resource. So thinking about this call to action as the why, and sometimes call to action and goals get confusing, like what's the difference? The call to action, again, it's like sometimes a need statement or a problem statement. What are the things that are happening that you need to have a program to address? So the example that we're going to use today, because I'm typically work in education spaces, I'm going to use an education related example. So if the call to action in my example is disparities based on race, ethnicity, language, gender, special education status in advanced level math courses in a school district. So that's the call to action. And therefore, because there are disparities in access and engagement in advanced level math courses in a school district, and those disparities are falling along race, ethnicity, language, gender, special education status, therefore then options for post-high school, college, and career are impacted. Okay, so that's the call to action. We've got this problem, these persistent disparities. So then the goal is, what's your big picture hope for your program or initiative? In my example, the big picture hope is greater equity in course taking and credit attainment in advanced level math courses. So that's the goal, greater equity in course taking and credit attainment in advanced level math courses. The goals, now this is one place where it very directly, the logic model has connections to your theory of action. The goal shows up in a theory of action, so make sure that it's the same goals that's showing up in your logic model. So that alignment is important. Okay, and again, if there are clarification questions or I'm using terms that aren't making sense, please jump in, feel free. Okay, Meg, yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, it sounds like theory of action and theory of change are the same, but the former specifies actions. Is that correct? Yeah, I mean, that's my interpretation of it, is that the theory, it's like, which is it going to dig more into? You know, theory of change breaks out or operationalizes the change part. Like you're probably hoping for different like stages of change. And so the theory of change kind of focuses on that. Theory of action then says, high level, what are the actions that are going to lead to what change? So the reason why we focus mostly on theory of action today is because the theory of a logic model is operationalizing more of a theory of action because it's got that action part in there, and the resources often too. So yes is the short answer after my long answer that I just gave. Yeah, it was a good, great question. Okay, this trips people up. This is one of the parts of logic models that trips people up. It's often also not there in other logic model templates. Sometimes contexts are, but necessary core assumptions is a component that we put in, and that it actually came out of conversations in developing logic models with organizations where there was something missing. They're like, yeah, but how come, like, what happens if no one believes this thing? It has nothing to do with the activities we're doing. It has nothing to do with the resources we're putting in. If people are coming in with an assumption that is in conflict with what our goal is, that's a problem. So part of what's great about a logic model is it puts it all out there, partly to have the conversation with each other, but also to make yourself accountable to what are these things that are necessary. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about contexts, because I think it's easier to understand what contexts are. Contexts are the external circumstances that form the setting for your program or initiative. And that these external situations or contexts or circumstances, specifically ones that impact your program. Okay, so with our example of advanced level math course taking, an example of a context that is very relevant right now is teacher staffing shortages. Okay, so teacher staffing shortages means that there are no subs to cover teachers to go do professional development sessions. So maybe part of your logic is that bringing greater equity into math learning means that we need to do some culturally responsive teaching training with the educators. If teachers can't get out of their course, their daily courses to go do professional development, you can't do that professional development. And your program probably there's not a whole lot it can do about the fact that we have massive teacher shortages right now and sub shortages. But it matters and it impacts your work. So you need to put it in there as part of the model, something that you're dealing with. Now we'll come back to, so yes, contexts are often things that you don't have control over, but you'll remember an underlying principle to culturally responsive and equitable evaluation is that you're trying to change those contexts, or you're trying to change those systems. So if part of what you're also trying to do is you realize, oh, wow, teacher staffing shortages are a huge problem in us trying to do what we're trying to do, then maybe one of your activities is advocacy that you're doing to greater resource school districts, so that you don't, so that you're attempting to change the conditions that are getting in the way of you doing what you feel needs to be done. All right, so then necessary core assumptions. Okay, so necessary core assumptions are, so an assumption is something that people accept as true or certain, oftentimes without proof. But an assumption, again, it's something that people accept as true or certain. A necessary core assumption for you are what do people need to believe and need to accept in order for this all to work? All right, so an example, back to our math example. A necessary core assumption is that increasing teacher training will improve practices in whatever the area was that the training happened. Now, sometimes the necessary core assumptions feel really obvious. But what we've found with working with groups is that sometimes the necessary core assumptions do feel obvious to your team because you're in the work, you're really close to it. But when you're trying to communicate these things and communicate the logic to other audiences, it might not be assumed as true. It might not be certain in their minds. And so by you making it explicit and naming it and saying it out loud, prompts some interesting conversations and also reflection on people's parts. Okay, a second example of a necessary core assumption that would come into our math example. Human beings come into social interactions with implicit biases that impact the way that they interact with others. That seems obvious to many of us, but it's something that is very important to whether you're trying to embed equity into math course taking in your school district. We know from decades and decades and decades of research that implicit bias plays into disparities in math outcomes across race, gender, special education status. So having that necessary core assumption, you'd need that in order to get to our goal, which was greater equity. Okay.
Annalee, can I just jump in real quick?
Please, please.
I really appreciate you spending some time focusing on this section of necessary core assumptions and context. And I think this is often what I've experienced where there can be a gap in communication between nonprofits and funders, that the focus is so much on the program and the activities and the sort of nuts and bolts logic. And then I think the funder, we get sort of focused on that. Okay, what are you going to do? And what are the outcomes going to be? And I think often because we're not in the day-to-day work and we're not necessarily experts in the field, we don't know all of those critical contexts or those critical core assumptions that you all are living with day in and day out. And so I think using a tool like this or using your proposal narrative in a way that has this kind of logic built into it and making those necessary core assumptions and context really explicit, I think can be super helpful for us as a funder to better understand, like, oh, those are the real obstacles and challenges to this work. And then ideally, we're having those conversations not at that critical juncture of just the proposal, but an ongoing dialogue about, like, to use Annalee's example. So if a critical piece of context is teacher shortages, and therefore maybe what's really needed for longer term change is advocacy and increased public revenue for school districts, let's talk about that. Okay, how, as a funder, how might we support that work? Who's already doing that work? Are you guys interested in doing that kind of work? So to me, that's like a really, really rich place of conversation and mutual learning between the funder and the grantee.
I couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate how you framed that, is that the way you describe that is towards partnership between funders and grantees towards systems change, right? That understanding of, like, what role can a funder have that maybe organizations or grantees and programs can't? I mean, there's clear power dynamics, right? Or like in communities, like, whose voices can be in certain spaces or are in certain spaces. And I really appreciate that. Yes. And if funders start to see the same necessary core assumptions come up and the same context come up again and again and again, that's really important data. Basically, that's really important input to start to reflect on and think about what can partnerships do towards those contexts, towards those circumstances. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving, but I really appreciate that. And again, please keep the questions coming, they're great. All right, I'm gonna start with outcomes. Oftentimes the logic models will start with resources and go to activities and then go to outcomes. But if you're really thinking back to that theory of change and the theory of action of like, what's the goal? We've got to build back from the goal. Okay, and I know that that's easier said than done. Okay, so outcomes, we'll spend a little time with outcomes because that is a very, very, very important part of the logic model and the logic. I will say too that defining, and I should have said this in the necessary core assumptions in the context. When we do logic model development sessions with organizations and groups, I'm in the middle of one right now. Well, not literally right now, but you know, in these couple weeks. And you think about, okay, one of the principles of culturally responsive evaluation is engaging stakeholders, engaging voices. A really great place to do that is in the defining of what are the contexts, what are the necessary core assumptions, and then what are the outcomes. So if you're looking to have, you can't have, you know, either because of time or access or whatever, you only have so much opportunity to engage voices in various parts of what you're doing. This is like a power spot to do that, is defining the outcomes. Because everyone is coming at it from different perspectives around what they think are possible for outcomes and what would be meaningful outcomes to actually get to the goals. Similarly, wherever you stand in your organization, it's only one perspective. And so you might not understand all the contexts that come into why the program is rolling out the way that it is. So again, that stakeholder engagement in these parts of the logic model are especially important. Okay, so what is an outcome? An outcome is what do you expect is going to happen because of the stuff you're doing? And then related, what needs to happen, what needs to change in order for you to get to your goal? All right, so that's like the backwards mapping from your goal. What outcomes, what changes have to happen with whom for you to get to your goal? So those changes, it's oftentimes helpful to think about changes in terms of, I'm going to say proximity, short-term, medium-term, long-term, and backwards map long to medium to short-term, or long to intermediate, or however you want to. Backwards map what are the big long-term outcomes, and then what are the small-term outcomes or short-term that you need to get to the long-term ones. A common question about short-term versus long-term outcomes is it always time? Like, are we always talking about amount of time when we talk about short-term and long-term? And no, I would think of it in terms more of proximity. So proximity to the actions. Okay, I'm going to give one more piece around outcomes, and then I'll give you the example from our math case. In addition to thinking about outcomes in terms of short-term, long-term, also think about outcomes in terms of levels. So there are outcomes that you likely are hoping to have with individuals. And maybe some of those individuals are youth. Maybe some of the individuals are adults. Maybe some are teachers, maybe, etc. You can also think about outcomes in terms of a family unit. You can also think of organizational level outcomes. Sometimes that comes down to culture, organizational culture, or organizational structures, or staffing. You know, how is the organization going to resource equity? How is it going to actually resource diversity? It has it as a goal. Is it resourcing it? And what does that mean on an organizational level? And then on a systems level, back to, you know, the example we were talking about on teacher shortages. Okay, so to our example, short-term outcomes in our advanced math course taking example could be So short-term outcomes could be increased teacher knowledge and skills with culturally responsive practices in math classrooms. So that could be a short-term goal. Short-term outcome is increasing the knowledge and skills of teachers to use more culturally responsive practices in their math classrooms. And then maybe a medium term is that teachers are consistently incorporating, they're constantly using culturally responsive practices in their math classrooms. So they learned how to do it. They have the knowledge and the skills. That's the short term. The fact that they're actually doing it in their classroom could be medium term. And then the long term is students are reporting that their math classrooms feel safe, respectful, responsive, and that they belong. And that is happening regardless of social identity, regardless of demographic group. And that there's equity in a feeling of belonging and success in a classroom. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about activities and outputs together, because they are close cousins in the logic model family. I gotta workshop that metaphor a little bit, but so activities and outputs are just different ways of representing kind of the same thing. So activities are processes, tools, events, actions that are happening to get to your outcomes. So the example that we put right into there, the example from our math example, is that maybe one of the activities you're doing are teacher workshops on culturally responsive teaching in math. And that's one of the activities. And then you remember the short-term outcome was a change in knowledge and skills from those workshops. So if that's the activity, oftentimes in a logic model, the way we represent that activity is in outputs. So first you describe it, that's the activities part of the logic model. And then the output is usually numeric, so it's usually quantifiable, and it's the direct product of that activity. And oftentimes it's who got how much of what. And so in our example, it could be 3 workshops per year for 9th grade math teachers. That would be the output related to the activity that we described earlier. So there is common confusion between outputs and outcomes. So outcomes are the changes you are hoping happen because of what you've described in the activities and outputs. So outputs are usually quantifiable. It's the quantified doing. Outcomes are the changes that result from the doing. Okay. Resources, in many ways, can be the easiest part of the logic model to do. It's the inputs. So sometimes resources are called inputs. It's what do you need to have to do the activities? That's why it's usually to the left of the activities part. What do you need in order to do that? I think what trips people up with resources is a lack of creativity and a lack of sensing. What actual resources are going into the doing and the activities? People often think of the financial resources like funding. They might think about other capital type resources like buildings. They may think of human resources, expertise, time, staffing. What oftentimes people don't think about is the sometimes intangible resources that you absolutely depend on. So think about if you are doing let's think about our math example. One of the resources that we depend on is youth and their amazing creativity and their amazing interest and curiosity about math. That's a resource. If we don't have that resource, the whole thing falls apart, right? If we don't have amazing, awesome youth, which we do always, and their curiosity, that's a resource that you have to have. Another common resource that people don't think about are networks, social networks, and specifically the social networks of those that you're hoping to work with in your program. So back to our example, if students are having a really good experience and it's getting better and better and better in the math, in their math classes, and you've got a bunch of seniors who now are saying, oh yeah, this math pathway or this particular teacher is awesome. I loved it. You should take that class. And they're saying that to sophomores. That social network is a key resource to you getting to where you want to get. Okay. So to come back to where does this sit in the context of culturally responsive evaluation? These are tools to help you define the it that you're hoping to systematically evaluate or systematically understand, systematically reflect on. It also has a lot of other uses besides evaluation. So logic models can be very helpful, again, in trying to communicate what you're trying to do to multiple audiences. We work with organizations who have a really super detailed, messy logic model. That's their working version that they use internally. And then they have this like beautiful outward publicly facing one that has lots of imagery and that's much more distilled, but is aligned to the working one. So you can have different versions of your logic, different versions of your logic model for different audiences. All right, I'm going to stop there. What questions do people have? Clarifications do people have about the process or any of the components that that we just described? As you're thinking, while you're thinking, there are some common, we kind of tried to bring up some examples of common questions that people have, like, well, what's the difference between an output and an outcome? An important question that I touched on earlier, who all is engaged when you're developing a logic model? The easiest, fastest way to develop a logic model is have one person do it sitting at their desk by themselves. That is the least culturally responsive way that you can do that. That's on one side of the spectrum. On the other side is every single person who's ever been involved in what you're doing has input into the logic model development process. That's not feasible. So you got to find somewhere in between. And I gave some examples of places like with defining outcomes, defining necessary core assumptions, where you can have a diverse group of voices come and help you think about how you would define those things. Yeah, okay. So Meg has a question. Do goals show up in the theory of change or action as the then? Yes, usually yes. And I say usually because, you know, again, 1,000,007 different ways that people interpret these things. That's how I would define it. Is the goals is the then part of the if then statement. So another common question, I don't know if it's a common question, but a common point of conversation and discussion that we'll come to groups with is to think about how and where do you represent things like racism, things like persistent inequity, systemic inequities. Where and how do you represent that in a logic model? It's a really complex conversation to have. It's a really important conversation to have. Back to when we were talking about necessary core assumptions and context. So thinking deeply around, if you are focused on equity and you're saying that you're focused on equity, how do you do that? Where do you do that? And where do you recognize and acknowledge and think critically around the places where things like racism show up in the logic? So I want to be conscious of time. We do, again, thank you so very much for being here. It's wonderful to see all your names, and hello to you all. So great to have you here. We do have, because we're always hoping to systematically reflect on what we're doing, we do have a very short feedback form that we'll put into chat for you to give us feedback on today, and also for your future interests in things that you might want to learn more about. Before we wrap up though, Andy, is there anything else you want to leave with the group before we sign off?
Yeah, just really emphasize. So I just put the link in the chat for a super brief survey. Just, I think it's 3 or 4 questions. It's if that is a way that would be helpful to you to give us feedback, please use it. Otherwise, please reach out. You can email me. I'll put my email address in here as well, but I think most of you have it. And again, I really want to try to emphasize that this is part of a longer term effort, and really want to open up dialogue with you all about what you're working on. And I think for me, again, those core contexts and assumptions in your work, I think we need to better understand those as a funder to really understand the work that you guys are trying to accomplish. And also, as Annalee said, so many of us are talking about things like systemic racism, and there's often this sort of notion that, oh, well, hey, this program it's going to solve all of it. Of course not. So how do we kind of make sense of that together? So yeah, please do reach out. I've already connected with a few of you, and I'll try to reach out some more. But also stay tuned for additional opportunities. Like I said, we're going to try to, in the future here, lean into allowing for more peer interaction and a little bit more of a lively dialogue space. So I've seen some stuff in the chat. So how do you view the last session? I'll put up the link again here. And this will also be the spot where this webinar that we're currently in will be recorded and posted. Angie said, there's a lot to digest. I found that until you have some practice working with these tools, it's hard to know what questions to ask. Can't wait to put things into practice. Absolutely, yep. And Angie, again, feel free to reach out and we can kind of assist you with that. And there's other resources we can connect you to. Tom says, from an output stance, many agencies tell us that they are trying to diversify their audiences by race and income, but are uncomfortable about how to measure numbers, how invasive to be about income, how to determine race, et cetera. Yeah, big questions, Tom. I'll maybe hold that for a minute and see if Annalee and Anthony have at least some initial responses. Zach says, yes, thank you for this. I look forward to looking at the recording and the beginning, which he missed. Yeah, so okay, so back to Tom's question. Any initial thoughts on that, Annalee and Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of organizations have laws around that too, especially with income. So, and then we have, right, the ethical kind of responsibility of people having the opportunity to know how their data is being used, or how data about them is being used. So I'm happy to think through. I think so much of it is context specific. I think one initial response is that if people have the opportunity to self-identify, that shifts the power a little as well. So we know all the limitations of how the US government has chosen to, for example, collect race data. That's very, very, very limiting in terms of allowing people to self-identify. So anyway, we can talk more. Anthony, I don't know if you have particular responses to that question too.
No, I really agree that it's case specific. I think we could work with folks one-on-one to get a sense about that. And we also want to make sure that people, the participants, are empowered to protect themselves in that conversation.
Liz, thanks for helping me out there. I was apparently only posting things in the chat to my fellow hosts and panelists. So she sent the link out to the webinar recordings and my email address to everyone. So hopefully you all have that now. So thank you again, Liz, for being a great teammate. And if there are no more immediate questions, thank you, Annalee and Anthony, so much for working with us on this. And we hope to hear from you all and be in conversation with you all soon. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy your Friday. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.